The book of First Maccabees is pretty much about these five brothers, the Maccabees family, they're sometimes called, but really, if you want to be technical, it was just Judas, at least during their lifetimes, who was called Maccabeus. The real name of the family is the Hasmoneans. And these five brothers, we've already seen a few of them die. Judas himself died in battle. Eleazar, the other one, and John just last week got killed by bandits. So the only two left are Jonathan and Simon. And Simon is kind of the older, the counselor brother, the advice giver, and Jonathan is the one currently in charge. And the last thing we saw happen last week is Jonathan get appointed high priest of Israel. And I would like to turn as we start just to Hebrews chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. And if someone gets there before I do, feel free to read it. Since it is 4 verses, I suppose I can. It says, "For every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God, in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins, being able to deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, since he himself also is beset with weakness." Apart from Christ, there has never been a perfect high priest. And because of it, because of his weakness, he is obligated, just as for the people, to also offer sacrifices for sins in the same way for himself. And no one takes this honor to himself, but receives it when he is called by God, even as Aaron was. And unfortunately, what we've seen in this time period, and this isn't the first time we've seen it, is that at this point in Israel's history, the high priesthood had turned into a political office, a political position. That it wasn't simply a religious responsibility, a spiritual position. And Jonathan accepted the high priesthood from a pagan king, someone who didn't even believe in the God of Israel. And so a man named Alexander Janus, claiming to be the son of Antiochus Epiphanes, came to Israel, fought against Demetrius, the current king, and overthrew him with Jonathan's help. And he's the one who appointed Jonathan as high priest of Israel, which was basically the equivalent of their king, though they did not call themselves kings. At this point, later, we're going to see that changed, and they did. They dropped pretenses, and the sons that were born to this family became increasingly more politically minded and increasingly more corrupt. And Jonathan represents the first stage in that step toward power corrupting this family, moving away from the goals they originally had in starting their rebellion. And the fact that he received honors, we're going to see several times today, actually, him receiving honors, being honored by pagan kings. And that in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. People in the Bible We see like Mordecai, like Daniel, were dressed in purple robes, honored in great ways by royalty. And we can't know Jonathan's heart. All we have is a record of his actions from a perspective that very much favored the Maccabees family and wants us to have a good impression of them. But yeah, even at this point, the movement Mattathias, the father of this family, started had changed into something else completely. Judas Maccabeus, the original leader after Mattathias himself, had been a soldier to the core. He was a fighter. He was courageous, sometimes even too courageous, which is what got him into trouble at the end. But Jonathan approached his problems very differently. He approached them as a politician, as a diplomat. And it's a good thing for the nation, actually, that at this time he did. He brought them through a very tumultuous time. The nation of Israel was a client kingdom. They were under the power of the Seleucid kingdom, of course, and the Seleucid kingdom at this time was very unstable. They had two halves of a family, and even other people coming in from the outside trying to gain authority, trying to gain control of the Seleucid kingdom, and it was growing weaker and weaker and weaker. They were losing territory to the Parthians in the east. Alexander the Great had stretched his kingdom all the way to India. It was significantly smaller than that now. It was being whittled away. And in the midst of that turmoil, largely because of Jonathan's leadership, Israel itself stayed stable and for the most part secure. But this is Alexander Ballas, the man who declared Jonathan high priest. He came from Asia Minor originally. Some people say from Ephesus. He was sponsored by the king of the Attalids, Attalus Philadelphus II, claimed, as I said, to be the son of Antiochus Epiphanes. And the first thing I have on your handout there is the last paragraph we read last week. Now King Alexander Ballas assembled large forces and encamped opposite Demetrius. And the two kings met in battle, and the army of Demetrius fled. And Alexander pursued him and defeated him. He pressed the battle strongly until the sun set, and Demetrius fell on that day. And so Alexander became for at least a short time the undisputed ruler of the Seleucid Empire, if you could call it that at this time. Then Ptolemy set out from Egypt. Not the same Ptolemy that established the Greek kingdom in Egypt, but a new Ptolemy. They were just about all named Ptolemy. He came out of Egypt. He and Cleopatra, his daughter, Cleopatra Thea specifically. And he came to Ptolemais in the 162nd year. And King Alexander met him, and Ptolemy gave him Cleopatra, his daughter, in marriage, and celebrated her wedding at Ptolemais with great pomp, as kings do. And this is a commemorative coin from that occasion. Commemorative coins are not a recent invention. This is a coin minted at the time of Alexander and Cleopatra Thea's marriage, and has both of them on it. And this is not the same Cleopatra that we think of when we hear the name Cleopatra. She was born later. She hasn't been born yet at this time. But part of the same family. Then King Alexander wrote to Jonathan, the high priest, to come to meet him. So Jonathan went with pomp to Ptolemais and met the two kings. He gave them and their friends silver and gold and many gifts, and found favor with them. A group of pestilent men from Israel, lawless men, gathered together against him to accuse him. But the king paid no attention to them, the king meaning Alexander, paid no attention to them. The king gave orders to take off Jonathan's garments and to clothe him in purple, and they did so. So the tables have turned somewhat. We're used to the Hellenists going to the Greek kings and having their way, being listened to because they share a culture. Here, Jonathan is being seen very clearly as the ruler of the nation, and these others as rebels, as a minority. And Jonathan is the one with wealth, the one who brings gifts, and these others are simply rabble rousers. So the tables have definitely turned against them. The conservatives are solidly in control. And in the 165th year, so 3 years after this, Demetrius, son of Demetrius, came from Crete to the land of his fathers. History would be a lot simpler if people just didn't have kids, but all these people did. When you get rid of one king, you haven't gotten rid of his line. And don't worry if this is getting confusing. I do have a family tree at the end of this, trying to give you an overview of everything that's happened here. But basically, there are two branches of the family that have been fighting with each other, the sons of Antiochus, Epiphanes, and the sons of Seleucus, Antiochus's brother, that he replaced. And this guy is from the line of Seleucus, and Demetrius II. And when King Alexander heard about this, that he had returned, come from Crete, he was greatly grieved, of course, and returned to Antioch. And Demetrius appointed Apollonius, I think is how you say that, the governor of Coelesyria, which is the area that included Israel at that point. So Demetrius appointed Apollonius governor. And Apollonius, assembled a large force and encamped against Jamnia, one of their cities. And he sent a rather demeaning and threatening letter to Jonathan saying, "You're not the one in charge anymore. You don't have power to resist us." So Jonathan chose 10,000 men and set out from Jerusalem. And Simon, his brother, met him to help him. He encamped against Joppa, but the men of the city closed its gates because Apollonius had a garrison in Joppa. The people there, at least the military people, were loyal to him. So Jonathan and his men, fought against Joppa, and the men of the city became afraid and opened the gates, and Jonathan gained possession of Joppa. And here's a map. It's a little small. I don't know if you can see it, but the green arrows show where the Hasmoneans, Jonathan and Simon, went. And the first arrow goes up there to Joppa, right there on the seacoast. You'll remember the place Jonah set sail from back in the day. When Apollonius heard of it, that Jonathan had captured Joppa, he mustered 3,000 cavalry and a large army and went to Azotus as though he were going further. Now, here's the little dotted red line. So that's Azotus right there. He went down there, acted like he was going further, but turned around instead. At the same time, he advanced into the plain, for he had a large troop of cavalry and put confidence in it. Jonathan pursued him to Azotus, and the armies engaged in battle. Now Apollonius had secretly left 1,000 cavalry behind him. Jonathan learned that there was an ambush behind him, for they surrounded his army and shot arrows at his men from early morning until late afternoon. But his men stood fast, as Jonathan commanded, and the enemy's horses grew tired. Apollonius's strategy depended on Jonathan fighting back, breaking ranks, trying to defeat his army, his cavalry, when they were still strong. But as it was, they stayed together, they kept their shields up, the enemy wasted their arrows, and they wore out their horses and accomplished nothing. Then Simon brought forward his force and engaged the phalanx, the armored troops, in battle, for the cavalry was exhausted, and they were overwhelmed by him and fled, and the cavalry was dispersed in the plain. Then they fled to Azotus and entered Beth Dagon, the temple of their idol. So Dagon, the old Philistine deity. Yep, they fled into the temple of their idol for safety. But Jonathan burned Azotus and the surrounding towns and plundered them. And the temple of Dagon and those who had taken refuge in it, he burned with fire. The number of those who fell by the sword, with those burned alive, came to 8,000 men. When King Alexander heard of these things, he honored Jonathan still more, and he sent to him a golden buckle, such as it is the custom to give to the kinsmen of kings. He also gave him Ekron and all its environments as his possession. And if Ekron sounds familiar, that's one of the ancient Philistine cities, one of their leading cities. It became Jonathan's at this point. Then the king of Egypt, Ptolemy, gathered great forces like the sand by the seashore and many ships, and he tried to get possession of Alexander's kingdom by trickery and add it to his own kingdom. He had kind of waited in Egypt as this went on, as both sides kind of weakened the other, waited until the opportune moment to come and act like he was there to help his son-in-law, Alexander. Oh yeah, and this is Ptolemy the Sixth now. He set out for Syria with peaceable words, and the people of the cities opened their gates to him and went out to meet him. For King Alexander had commanded them to meet him, since he was Alexander's father-in-law. Alexander was married to his daughter, Cleopatra Thea. But when Ptolemy entered the cities, he stationed forces as a garrison in each city. They opened to him in peace. He left soldiers there to keep control for him. And he took control of the country as Alexander was off fighting elsewhere. King Ptolemy gained control of the coastal cities as far as Seleucia by the sea, and he kept devising evil designs against Alexander. He sent envoys to King Demetrius, so Demetrius II, the man fighting Alexander, saying, "Come, let us make a covenant with each other, and I will give you in marriage my daughter who was Alexander's wife, and you shall reign over your father's kingdom. For I now regret that I have made him, for I now regret that I gave him my daughter, for he has tried to kill me." He threw blame on Alexander because he coveted his kingdom. So he took his daughter away from him and gave her to Demetrius. He was estranged from Alexander, and their enmity became manifest. So a very negative portrayal of Ptolemy here, of course, but it's from a perspective of people who favor Alexander because he was kind to the Jewish nation. He is the one who honored them, gave Jonathan the high priesthood. But at least according to Ptolemy here, Alexander had made an attempt on his life. So he's striking back now. He's getting back at Alexander by taking his daughter away from him and giving her to Demetrius. But then Ptolemy entered Antioch, the Seleucid capital, and put on the crown of Asia. Now King Alexander was in Cilicia at that time, because the people of that region were in revolt, which explains how Ptolemy was able to pull this off, take over these cities, take Cleopatra, his daughter, away, and do all these things. Alexander wasn't there to stop him. And Alexander heard of it and came against Ptolemy in battle. Ptolemy marched out and met him with a strong force and put him to flight. Although in the battle, Ptolemy himself was severely wounded. So Ptolemy was wounded. Alexander lost the battle and was forced to flee. So Alexander fled into Arabia to find protection there. And King Ptolemy was exalted. For a very brief time, he was king of both the Ptolemaic area and the Seleucid area. And Demetrius was co-ruler or ruler of part of that area as well, at least officially. And Zabdiel, the Arab, cut off the head of Alexander and sent it to Ptolemy. So Alexander Ballas is out of the picture. But he also had a kid, so not really. But King Ptolemy died 3 days later from the wound that he had received in battle. So he lived long enough to see his triumph, but not to enjoy his triumph. And his troops in the strongholds were killed by the inhabitants of the strongholds. So Demetrius II became king in the 167th year. In those days, Jonathan assembled the men of Judah to attack the citadel in Jerusalem, and he built many engines of war to use against it. This citadel was a thorn in the side of the Hasmoneans ever since it was taken over by the men of Antiochus IV. There is probably where it was, right adjacent to the temple complex, so they could look down into the temple area. And as you can also see, it is against the city wall. So just because somebody controls the city does not mean that they control the Acra, that fortress. They can still get supplies in from the outside, which is what they did for quite a while. They just had to defend that area. And it was very fortified. Jonathan decided once more to root out these people, the Hellenists that were there, who were causing him trouble. But certain lawless men who hated their nation, in other words, Hellenists, Greek cultured Jews, went to the king, Demetrius II, and reported to him that Jonathan was besieging the citadel. When he heard this, he was angry, and as soon as he heard it, he set out and came to Ptolemais. And he wrote Jonathan not to continue the siege. Remember, Jonathan has fought against the man he appointed, Demetrius II had appointed as governor of this region. Jonathan was Alexander's man. He was a member of the losing side in the recent war. So the advantage, the upper hand he had, he's lost. Yep. So he wrote Jonathan not to continue the siege, but to meet him for a conference at Ptolemais as quickly as possible. When Jonathan heard this, he gave orders to continue the siege, and he chose some of the elders of Israel and some of the priests, and put himself in danger. For he went to the king at Ptolemais, taking silver and gold and clothing and other numerous gifts, and he won his favor. Although certain lawless men of his nation kept making complaints against him, the king treated him as his predecessors had treated him. He exalted him in the presence of all his friends. He confirmed him. Demetrius confirmed Jonathan in the high priesthood and in as many other honors as he had formerly had, and made him to be regarded as one of his chief friends. So Jonathan, it's pretty clear, had a way with words, had a way with gifts and how he presented them, with the way that he honored the kings that he had to deal with, and navigated himself out of a very bad situation here that could have put the nation once more into a position of being at war with the Seleucids. But as it was, they had peace. Now, when King Demetrius saw that the land was quiet before him, and that there was no opposition to him, he dismissed all his troops, each man to his own place, except the foreign troops that he had recruited from the islands of the nations. It was expensive to keep a large standing army when you had nobody to fight. This was a very bad decision for him politically. So all the troops who had served his fathers hated him. They became unemployed and resented him for this decision. And now we meet another guy who's going to become quite important in the events that follow, but this is the first time we've seen him mentioned. Now, Trypho had formerly been one of Alexander's supporters, part of Alexander's government. He saw that all the troops were murmuring against Demetrius, and in this he sees an opportunity. The army does not like the king. So he went to Amalku, the Arab, who was bringing up Antiochus, the young son of Alexander, and insistently urged him to hand Antiochus over to him to become king in place of his father. So here's that family tree I promised. Up at the top, you have Antiochus III. He's a very powerful ruler, but he's also the one that got the Seleucid kingdom into trouble in the first place with Rome. Got defeated by the Romans in Greece. They had that huge debt to take care of. Nothing tears a family apart like money trouble or a kingdom. But he had two sons. Seleucus IV died and was replaced by Antiochus IV. So Antiochus IV, even though he was the younger son, became king, and the next rightful king should have been Demetrius, the son of Seleucus. That guy right there. But instead, Antiochus IV was technically just a regent. But instead of leaving the kingdom to Demetrius, Antiochus decided to leave it to his son, Antiochus V. Demetrius returned from Rome, killed Antiochus V, and became king anyway. After that, Alexander Ballus, claiming to be the son of Antiochus IV, that's why it's a dotted line, because we don't really know for sure that he was, he challenged Demetrius, and with Jonathan's help defeated him. But then after that, Demetrius' son, Demetrius II, came back and tried to claim the throne. So it all sounds more complicated than it is. It really is just these two family lines fighting each other. And then in the middle there, of course, you have Ptolemy VI, who gives his daughter, Cleopatra Thea, first to Alexander Ballus and then to Demetrius II. So she was married to both of them. And then Alexander Ballus is the one who had a son named Antiochus VI. And now one of Alexander's supporters, Trypho, is taking the very, very young Antiochus VI under his wing, using him as an excuse to fight Demetrius II, saying, this is the rightful king. Let's all get behind him. And got the army on his side. Now Jonathan sent to King Demetrius the request that he remove the troops from the citadel from Jerusalem and the troops from the strongholds, for they kept fighting against Israel. Remember, they had put troops in strongholds all over the nation of Israel to keep Israel in line, and those troops were still there, and they were basically brigands. They were causing trouble for the people, raiding the areas around them. And Demetrius sent this message to Jonathan: not only will I do these things for you and your nation, but I will confer great honor on you and your nation if I find an opportunity. That's an important little clause in there. So it's not an explicit promise. If I find an opportunity, I will give you great honor. Now then, you will do well to send me men who will help me, for all my troops have revolted. So Jonathan sent 3,000 stalwart men to him at Antioch, and when they came to the king rejoiced at their arrival. And the red line along the coast there is the troops that went up from Jerusalem to Antioch to help Demetrius II with this riot. These people, mainly members of his army previously, who now hated him because he had fired them, they're attacking the king. The men of the city, it says, assembled within the city, and the number, to the number of 120,000, and they wanted to kill the king. But the king fled into the palace. Then the men of the city seized the main streets of the city and began to fight. Like a French Revolution barricade situation, there was fighting in the streets of the city, and those fighting for the king were his own mercenaries and these Jewish soldiers that had come to help him. The king called the Jews to his aid, and they rallied about him, and then spread out throughout the city. And they killed on that day as many as 100,000 men. They set fire to the city and seized much spoil on that day, and they saved the king. We're just about done. Let's finish this up. So King Demetrius sat on the throne of his kingdom, and the land was quiet before him once again. But he broke his word about all that he had promised, and he became estranged from Jonathan, and did not repay the favors that Jonathan had done him, but oppressed him greatly. So Demetrius II was just really good at alienating people. He alienated his army, and now he alienated Jonathan by refusing to do what he said he would. Anybody who could have helped him against Trypho. After this, Trypho returned from Arabia, and with him the young boy Antiochus, who began to reign and put on the crown. All the troops that Demetrius had cast off gathered around him, Antiochus and Trypho. And they fought against Demetrius, and Demetrius fled and was routed. And Trypho captured the elephants and gained control of Antioch. Then the young Antiochus wrote to Jonathan, saying, I confirm you in the high priesthood and set you over the 4 districts, and make you one of the friends of the king. And he sent him gold plate and table service, and granted him the right to drink from gold cups and dress in purple and wear a gold buckle, and gave him the honors of a king. And Solomon his brother he made governor from the ladder of Tyre to the borders of Egypt. That's that little note you see on the side of the map there, that Simon was made governor of that region. And when we come back next week, it's going to be Trypho and the young king Antiochus that we have to deal with. Like I said, it's going to be only a few more weeks until we're done with this generation, at least, of this family, and done with the book of First Maccabees, and we'll start having to rely more on Josephus and other historical sources. But any questions about what we went over today? All right, let's close in prayer. Father, thank you so much for the way that you work, what we've seen again and again, what we've been reminded of just looking at the history of the past, and what we're reminded of looking at the history that we're going through today is how in control you are, even of situations that seem so big and so out of control. And what seems like an absolute mess and a tangle to us is very simple to you. And that you can give us strength, you can give us wisdom when we need it to navigate the events around us, the events of life. Help us to keep you the focus of everything we do, wherever we go, wherever you call us, and whatever you call us to do. May we make you our strength and do all things for your glory, to never lose sight of why we're fighting. Help us to honor you this morning in everything we do, and with the worship we bring to you. In Jesus' name, amen.